It's midnight. You're in the woods, huddled around a campfire with all your friends, and somebody is telling a story, and everyone is listening intently. Have you always wanted to be the storyteller? Well, stay tuned because my guest is going to show you how.
Welcome to Page One, the award-winning show for writers with the reader in mind.
That draws the reader along, just like fiction.
Here's your host and producer, Zita Christian.
Hi, everyone. I am absolutely delighted for you to meet my guest tonight. His name is Matt Dix, and he is a Renaissance man when it comes to the world of communication. He has written comic books, rock operas, novels, and a book that is very, very special to my heart, and that's the one we're going to be talking about tonight. It's called Storyworthy. And if you watch the Open about storytelling, you have an idea of what we're going to talk about. So first, Matt, thanks very much for being on the show.
Thank you, and it's an honor to be here.
Thank you, thank you. So I know when I was doing a little research before the show that you have taught the whole idea of storytelling to a rabbi, a priest, that sounds like a joke, and let's see, an English teacher, a professional entertainer, a lawyer, a journalist, politicians. I mean, it goes on and on. So what kind of stories do you teach, or what is it about storytelling that you teach?
Well, I teach personal storytelling, so we're talking about the stories from our own lives. And because they're personal stories from our lives, everyone can use them. You know, whether you are a rabbi or you are a politician or you're a parent who wants to tell the story of your life to your child, we all have those stories. And so I teach rabbis to tell excellent stories to their congregants and politicians to speak to, you know, potential voters. I was in Canada earlier this year teaching Mohawk Indians to tell stories in the native language that they're learning. You know, corporations, nonprofits, everyone can use storytelling, and it just makes you a better person when you can tell a good story.
Well, one of the things that you mentioned in your book is about how important it is to be honest in the stories you're telling. And so I think that I'm going to use this moment here to mention also that I'm guessing that all of you in the audience know about this, but maybe not. Matt is a winner at over 36 times of the Moth, the championship, and 5 times Grand Slam winner. So just in case there are people out there who don't know what the Moth is, tell me about that first, because I think that feeds right into the whole idea of the personal stories.
Yeah, the Moth is sort of the biggest storytelling organization in the world. It's centered in New York, but now in more than 20 cities around the country and 3 countries around the world. Essentially, any night in the year, you can find a story slam where people take the stage at a bookstore or a theater or a bar, and they tell a true personal story that lasts somewhere between 5 and 6 minutes. And in these situations are competitions. So there's judges in the audience who are judging your story, and at the end of the night, a winner is determined. You know, the competition is fun, and for me, being a terribly competitive person, it appeals a great deal to me. But the important thing is that there's a stage for anyone to take on any given night and share a story from their life to an audience that is truly magnificent. People don't come to storytelling shows in a bad mood. They come ready to hear stories and excited about what's happening on stage.
And there's no notes for this.
No notes, right from the heart.
Well, that's scary.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right, so that idea of coming to the Moth, standing up, telling your personal story, that feeds into the question I had about, you talk about being honest and vulnerable in telling a story, as opposed to like being a stand-up comic. Talk to me about that.
Yeah, it's what's most important in storytelling. I always say the hard thing is the best thing. And so it's hard to tell a story where there's authenticity and vulnerability. It's a difficult thing for human beings to do, which is why people are drawn to it. We're really not interested in hearing about your success stories. We don't like braggers. Yeah. It is easy to get on the stage and talk about the successes you've had in life. What we really need to hear and what we want to hear is people to talk about their embarrassments, their failures, their shames.
Yeah.
Those are the stories that people want, because those are the stories that let everyone in the world know you're not alone. We sort of stew in our own shame. You know,
Yes.
we get embarrassed and we think we're the only one. But if we hear someone who is brave enough to talk about it on a stage in front of 200 people, it just makes us understand that it's human to be stupid. It is human to be a loser. It is human to fail in many ways. And it just makes us all feel a little bit better about who we are as a person.
And maybe it makes it a little easier for us to tell our own story about things that went wrong.
I like to think so. Now, sometimes
Okay.
it's like, you know, twisting an arm and, you know, throwing them on the stage, you know, to get them to do that. But I do think that the more we see people express truth and vulnerability on stage, the more likely we're willing to do it ourselves.
I agree with you. You also talk in the book about how important it is to express our truth. Not just the fact that, okay, I failed at this or I was embarrassed at that, but our truth. And when do we know, like in the course of human existence, when do we know what our truth is?
Well, I think we have lots of different truths, thankfully, so we can be searching for each one. Essentially what I mean is that when something happens to us, a real thing, a real moment, you know, the kind of hair on the back of your neck, you know, your heart skips a beat
Yeah.
moment, oftentimes there's something deeper inside other than just the simplicity of what has just happened. It's speaking to our heart and our mind. And when we take the time to ask ourselves, like, why do we do the things that we do, which is a question I love asking myself, or we ask ourselves, why do I feel this way? Why am I reacting this way? That is when we can find the truth of what is really happening. And that changes it from, here's a thing that happened to me, versus, here is how I feel about a thing that happened to me. That's when you get a really good story.
Oh, yeah. And you keep going into the whys and uncovering. Now, I also know that you teach 5th grade.
I do.
So one of the things that occurred to me when I was reading your book was, and 5th grade is, you know, in today, 2020, certainly different than, you know, when I was a kid. But do you encourage students to tell their stories, and do they have, even in the 5th grade, do they have a sense of what their truth is?
Yes, they do. I encourage it quite a bit. I start by telling them stories. I tell them my embarrassing moments, and I'm trying to get them to understand that if I will share my embarrassments with you, when you have an embarrassment this year, and you'll have many.
Oh, yes.
You know, at 10 years old, your life is just a perpetual state of embarrassment. I want them to feel free to share with me. And so, yeah, they have real stories about real things. And one of the best things that happens to me is when I start sharing stories with them, they share real stuff with me. You know, there was the year when I told my students about being homeless. There was a time in my life when I was homeless. And that was the day that a little girl came up to me and told me she spent the summer in a car with her mother, and she was worried that they would end up in a car again. And she didn't think she had anyone to talk to about that. And suddenly I shared a story, and she felt, oh, I'm connected to him. We share something. Now he's safe to speak to.
And you're the teacher, so that also, I would think, lends some feeling of possibility that life won't always be this way, that
Right.
there's hope.
Yes, but even just the understanding is really useful. You know, there was a time when I was in jail. I always tell that story to my students. More than once, a student has come up to me after I've told that story to talk to me about a relative that they have who's in prison. And they have not told anyone in school that they have a relative in prison. And I tell them right away, I wasn't in prison, I was in jail. There's a very big difference.
Yes.
But it allows them to speak to me about those things. And those are big things, but there's lots of little things too. There's lots of little moments that kids have on playgrounds and in homes and on the bus that they often feel like they can't share with an adult. You know, when you were a kid, probably teachers were like black boxes. Like you didn't know, even if they were married sometimes, if they had kids, they sort of never spoke about themselves.
No, mine were mostly nuns, and they really were like black boxes.
Right, so that's a hard thing to not really feel like the adult you spend most of your time with over the course of a day isn't a person you can speak to. And so I don't want to be that teacher. And so I share stories, and then they start to share stories in return.
I'm very glad to hear that. And do you find any kind of common themes in their stories? I'm trying to get an idea of 5th grade today, things that concern them.
Yeah, bullying is a big thing for kids.
Sure,
They
yeah.
don't like to be made fun of, and it's hurtful and terrible for them. You know, when they are from a family with divorce, that is a really challenging thing for lots and lots of kids. We have kids who struggle in certain areas. You know, they might have a learning disability, they might have a physical disability, and it is not something that they're comfortable speaking about unless an environment is created where vulnerability, authenticity, and truth are welcomed, accepted, and celebrated.
And that's exactly what you promote in the whole idea of something being story-worthy.
Right.
So, that's absolutely perfect. You know, I think Mr. Rogers would have liked you. Because you have something similar there where you're using a technique to bring out that, to open a door for a child, to say, here's a safe place.
I use that phrase all the time. I say, we tell our stories so that we can open doors and allow kids to come into our hearts and minds. Because that's where they want to be. You know, I can teach math and I can teach reading and all of those important things, but I really honestly believe that the things that I teach that are most important are things like kindness and hard work and perseverance and the understanding that life is rotten sometimes.
Yeah, it is.
And we have to overcome the rottenness. And one of the ways to overcome it is to understand we're not alone. Because kids always feel like they are the only one.
Sure.
And so I fight like hell to make them understand that they're just part of this human race.
Well, you know, you mentioned just a minute ago about it, during your life that you had been in jail, that there was a time when you had been homeless. And I happen to know from reading about you that you died twice. You were brought back to life by paramedics. I mean, it was a real twice, and you were young at the time. And yet, those great big things, what you talk about in your book is the importance of those little moments.
Yes.
So tell me why the little moments are so important and not the great big events.
So if I was to tell you the story of the time I died, let's say, I went through a windshield when I was 17 years old in a head-on car accident. They brought me back to life through CPR. I was gone for about a minute. You and I are not going to connect very well on that level because you've never been through a windshield.
Very true.
And so you can't sit there and think, oh, I know what that feels like, right? So those stories are hard to tell. I often say when we have a big story like that, we have to find something small within it. Because what we're looking for when I'm telling a story is to make a connection to other human beings. So I'm looking for universal truths, things that people will all understand. And the best thing is those small stories, those tiny moments in our lives when our heart flutters, when we suddenly think differently. You know, when someone says something to us and it affects us in a certain way, those are the stories people understand. They're the easiest stories to tell. The hardest stories to tell are your big stories. Those are the ones people want to tell right away. And they're often told poorly because there's nothing in there that makes the audience think, I am like him. I am connecting to him on a level. And then the story is forgotten. So telling big stories is fine, and there's ways to do it. I teach all about the ways to do those things. But I always tell people, start with something small. The little things are just beautiful.
They are, and they have a magic all their own. I want to get into how you keep track of little things in order to tell those stories. But before I do, I just want to mention, if you just happen to tune in now, this is page 1. I'm Zita Christian, and my guest is Matt Dixon. He is the author of the book Storyworthy. He's the author of many books, but we're talking about Storyworthy tonight. And he has a beautiful TEDx talk that you can find on YouTube. In fact, if you go to youtube.com/Matthew Dixon, we'll show you that graphic a little later. But I just want you to know that because he is going to be talking about a whole lot of really wonderful things here tonight, and I don't want anybody to miss anything if they come in late.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So the small moments, you have this technique that you have devised. Homework for life.
Homework for life.
Tell me about that.
So I was telling stories around the world, and I had a list of all the stories I planned on telling. And I started running out of stories. I was getting worried. And I know the storytellers who have like 12 stories and they just roll out the old chestnuts and, it's story after. It's always the same one. I didn't want to be that person. Every time I take a stage, I want a new story. So I assigned myself the homework first. I'm an elementary school teacher. I'm inclined to give myself homework. And it was simple. All I said to myself was, at the end of every day, I'm going to reflect on my day. And I'm going to look for the moment from that day that is the most story-worthy. In other words, if someone forced me on a stage and said, tell a story from today, what would it be? Even if the thing that I ultimately find in my day is not story-worthy, it's not worth telling, I'm still going to look for it. I'm going to look for the moment that makes this day different than any other day. And then I write it down. I don't write the whole story down because that's insanity.
Yeah.
Those are journalers. They're very precious people. They tend to journal a lot when people break up with them. And then they tend to not journal when they're in love, right? That's how journals work. I don't want that. I believe in small things that become habits, like teeth brushing, same thing.
Yes.
So I use a spreadsheet. Essentially, it's 2 columns. There's a date, and then I stretch that B column across the screen, and in that small space, I write my moment. What about today was different than any other day? My goal was maybe 1 new story a month. That would be fantastic. What happened, though, was incredible. I had no expectation. I discovered that by being reflective about your day, by asking yourself that hard question, what would I say about today? I discovered our lives are filled with stories.
Yes.
More stories than we could ever imagine. And I'm not special in any way. I've been teaching this now for 8 years, and it's not an exaggeration to say thousands of people are doing it. And every day, if we went over to my phone and opened it now, there would be an email from a person telling me, I just finished 100 days of homework for life, and it's changed my life. What happens is we just suddenly develop a lens I didn't know I had, where people say things, and we see things, and we think things that are all story-worthy. And then the other beautiful thing that happens is, as you start this process, I always think of it as you crack open. There's so much from our past that we have allowed to disappear, to be
Yes.
forgotten. And it's tragic. You know, just think about if you're a parent, how often while your kids were growing up, you said, you're not going to believe what my kid said. I got to write that down. But no one ever does. And then suddenly your kid is 18 and you don't know where the time went.
Yeah.
We throw it away like it's worthless. We'll walk down a sidewalk, see a quarter on the ground. We have no idea where the quarter was, who previously held it, but we'll pick it up and put it in our pocket. But our kid says a beautiful thing to us, or a colleague says something to us that makes our heart stir, or we watch something on the news that changes our mind completely, and then we throw that memory away. But we'll pick a quarter up. And so what happens is you start to look at your day, you start to look for those story-worthy moments, and things will spill out from the past. Things you can't believe you have forgotten. And that becomes part of my homework for life too. So in the beginning I was finding 1 moment a day, but now it's not uncommon for me to have 5 or 6 moments per day. Not all of them are going to be stories. Not all of them are worth standing on stages and talking about, but they're moments I don't want to forget anyway. I want to hold these moments forever. You know, I want them to be for me and for people who come after me. And so even if you're not a storyteller, even if you're not a writer, if you have no plans in communicating with any human being for the rest of your life, if you're a mute, I still think you need to be doing homework for life. It'll do things like it slows your days down.
Yes.
It records your time. You know, just ask someone, I love this question, what did you do in your 26th year of life? And you quickly realize that you have completely discarded a year of your life. That unless you got married or started a new job or had a baby, you probably don't remember a single thing from your 26th year of your life, and I don't want that to happen to anyone.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I can tell you, though, since for, I would say, at least 30 or 40 years, I have been keeping, not as in the kind of detail that you have, but I have written down like a few things for each month over the years. Now, there's a long computer document.
Right.
And I had to do part of it for an exercise for a class one time, but I liked it so much I just kept going.
Well, that's great.
So, Matt, I want to jump gears here just for a minute, because when I told some of the people on my, I have a podcast called Ritual Recipes, and I'm in a group on Facebook that is all about podcasting. So I told them that I was going to be interviewing you, and because now you and Elysha have, your wife, have a podcast, Speak Up Storytelling. Speak Up Storytelling.
Yep.
So let me just mention that one of the things that I noticed, because once I discovered it, it's like, oh my God, I'm going to binge listen. So somebody gets on the podcast and they tell a story like they would at the Moth or someplace, but then you critique it. You and Elysha go through and critique the story. What do you want listeners to learn when they hear you critique a story, because they hear the story first in the voice of the storyteller.
Right.
So what do you want the listener to get?
I mean, I want them to be better storytellers, ultimately. I think that the world is a better place when people are telling good stories.
Yes.
And I don't think that we have a world filled with good storytelling. I think we have a world filled with bad storytelling.
Yeah, I agree.
You know, and if you're at a cocktail party, you know it because you have been in that situation where you're listening to someone and you're just hoping that someone will come along and take your place so that you can escape the terrible person that you're spending time with. I think that happens to us all the time. So we listen to stories that are recorded at our shows. We produce shows in the Hartford area. We play one of those stories, and then we talk about the good things those storytellers are doing. There are people who have worked with us before they ever took the stage, so they're finely crafted stories. And then we look for things that could be improved. And my goal, hopefully, is that in listening to it, you're entertained by the story, first of all. We're only choosing great stories. And then you learn some of the simple techniques, because storytelling is beautiful in that I can take a terrible storyteller and make them into a very, very good storyteller in very little time. It's not that hard. Most of the time, storytelling is about decision making. The problem is people don't think before they speak. They just say the first thing that comes to their mind, rather than taking a moment and considering, where should I really start? Where should I really end? What should I do in the middle to make it a little more engaging? And so truly, I have taken horrendous storytellers who you would never want to hear a single word out of, and in a very short period of time, they're on our stage and telling stories very effectively.
So that makes me remember. I wanted to also mention that, you know, throughout the Hartford area, in fact, New England and beyond, Matt teaches workshops for storytellers. So you can go to his website and you can find all kinds of information about that. But I want to go back to the podcasting thing for a minute, because when I told my fellow podcasters that I was going to interview you, and I asked, do you have any questions? So three of them came up.
Okay.
So the first one is from Dave Jackson, the Dave Jackson from School of Podcasting. And he wants to know, when somebody asks you, how was your day? Do you just start to talk, or are you immediately implementing storytelling techniques?
I love that question. When someone says, how was your day? What they really are asking you, and what I always hear is, what is the most interesting thing from your day? And so I think spouses come home quite often and, you know, a spouse says, how was your day? And they start, well, at 9 o'clock, and they go through their day. No one has ever wanted that. No one wants a chronological account of your day. So when I hear that question, how was your day? I think about what is the most meaningful moment of my day, and yes, I'm using those techniques. Now I've gotten to the point that I do it almost instantaneously. And I have lots of people who I've worked with who can sort of do that same thing. We do improv exercises in our workshops where you're forced to sort of use the strategies on the fly without any preparation. So yes, it's true that whenever you're with me, if something happened to me 10 minutes ago that I want to share with you, it's going to be a little crafty. I know where to start, I know where to end, I know how to hold your attention, I know where the humor goes. I do all those things very automatically, but you can get there too.
And then it's going to wind up on that spreadsheet at night in that homework for life.
It will, yes.
Absolutely. Okay, so the next question comes from Kim Craggy from Toastmasters 101. You met her in Boston. She was at your recent workshop in Boston. She had a hat on. And I told her that...
No, I know who you mean.
Yes, yes. So she said she wants to know how you developed your skills. She said, before you got on the Moth, what made you want to tell stories?
I didn't want to initially. I mean, I was writing novels, so I was a storyteller in a way, fictional. I was writing some columns for magazines. I never envisioned myself taking a stage. My friends told me that I have the worst life of anyone they've ever heard, or at least the most unfortunate life. And they thought, you should go to New York and tell stories for the Moth because you'll be amazing. Now, I quickly learned that my most unfortunate moments don't make my best stories. They are the hardest stories to tell. They're the big stories. I've gotten around to most of them, but it was my friends that got me on stage first. Now, I went back in 2011. That's when I told my very first story. I went to the New Eureka's Poets Cafe in downtown for a Moth Story Slam, what I thought was going to be my only time ever telling a story on stage. I dropped my name in the hat. I prayed that I wouldn't be picked, that I would go home and say I tried. They picked me 10th. I took the stage. I told a story. I won. The competition was wonderful. I really liked to win.
Wonderful.
But honestly, it was the moment I began speaking into the microphone, I sort of felt like I was at home. And I knew I was going to be doing this for a long time.
Well, speaking of the whole idea of speaking into a microphone, I know that part of in your other life, you were a wedding DJ for many, many years.
Yeah.
We have that wedding background in common too. And so you are not intimidated by speaking into a microphone. And that's got to be a thing for some people.
It's huge. I used to tell people in my workshops that I just stumbled upon something that I was naturally good at later in life. And then one day my wife heard me say that, and she said, "Is that what you're really telling people?" And I said, "Yeah." And she said, "You're an idiot." And she pointed out that, first of all, I'm a writer. I'm a novelist, and I've been writing stories every single day of my life since I was 17 without missing a day. So of course I understand how stories function better than most people. I'm also an elementary school teacher, so I stand in front of the worst audience that you can possibly stand in front of, 10-year-old children, and I have to hold their attention for 7 hours. So of course I have developed techniques to keep them surprised and entertained and laughing. And then I'm a wedding DJ for more than 20 years.
Yeah.
So I spend Saturday nights trying to get 200 drunken wedding guests to do what I need them to do. Yeah. And so that eliminated all the fear that I had speaking in front of people. So when I took the stage that night at the Moth and One, it really was a combination of those three things coming into action all at once in front of a microphone. I was sort of training to become a storyteller long before I ever thought I was going to be one.
The stars really aligned for you.
They aligned for me.
Absolutely.
Honestly, probably for the only time in my life they aligned for me.
Well, thank goodness they did that.
Yes.
Yeah. So we only have about 2 minutes left. I have one more question here. David Hooper from the podcast Red, which is he's revising that, and he's going to be doing a lot of interviews and build a big podcast. He does a lot of marketing. He wants to know how to best use storytelling when you are the one who is interviewing a guest. Like, how can you use the storytelling to bring out something in the guest?
I guess what I would do is, I think stories are about what I call 5-second moments in people's lives. I think they're moments of realization or transformation. And if you get people talking about that, if you identify in their life a moment where you can see that realization or transformation, and you target that as the question you're going to ask, rather than sort of the questions I get at the golf course, like what do you do for a living and how do you spend your day? Instead, when you ask the questions that generate good stories. So looking into someone's biography, figuring out those key moments in their lives, and aiming right at them and saying, I know that when you were 18 years old, the love of your life broke up with you. I read that story. Tell me about the moment she broke up with you. Not tell me about the girl, tell me about the moment that everything changed.
Beautiful.
And then you'll get a good story.
Oh, I love that. And unfortunately, we're going to have to, shoot, I can't believe we're out of time. I have more questions to ask you. I do want to mention, though, you have a new version of this book coming out, don't you? Or you're working on it?
I'm working on a sequel.
A sequel. Okay, and will there be, is it more story, or new and different stories, or is it new and different insights into
It's new insights. It's going to be essentially storytelling in terms of healing. It's the idea that when we tell our stories, we can become significantly healthier, happier, and better people. And it is something that I've known for a long time, and I always thought sounded hokey. And so I was reticent to say it to people. But now I understand that it changes lives.
And may it be so. Absolutely. So, Matt Dix, thank you very, very much for being on the show. I also want to give a thank you to my crew. I want to say a special thank you to Phyllis Gordon. I bumped into her literally in the Highland Park Market, and we were both apologizing to each other, and then she looked at me and she said, I watch your show all the time, and I just melted. I just absolutely melted. And I love to close this show with the words of the late fantasy writer Ursula Le Guin, who said, there have been civilizations that did not use the wheel, but there have been no civilizations that did not tell stories. So find your story, find a way to tell it, and join us again next time. Thank you.
Food for the crew and guests is provided by Manchester Grill of Manchester, Connecticut, and Angelo's Restaurant of Glastonbury, Connecticut.